For Expediting Blockchain, what it means for businesses today and in the future, please welcome our panel, which will be introduced and moderated by Blockchain Technology Lead at Deloitte Canada, Kshitish Balhotra.
So let's get started on talking about expediting blockchain.
Hi, I'm Chris Brodersen. I lead the blockchain lab for Deloitte in New York.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jack Kiernan, based out of New York City. Work across a few different industries, telecommunications, financial services, oil and gas, and seek to put blockchain into some well-established businesses.
Hi, Dhananjay Goswami here. I work primarily with technical architectures across various industries, primarily FSI, government, and retail.
Okay. Let's see if this works now. My name is Sapan. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer for a startup based out of Toronto called Prescient. We are working deeply in the area of creative industries, publishing, visual arts, audio and video.
Okay, so let's start with the first question. And the question that usually we get is, what are the biggest challenges that you see around blockchain adoption in enterprise?
I can start. I think it depends on whether you're looking from a business side or technology side. On the business side, I think the biggest one that has emerged is bringing consortiums together and making them, or agreeing on what data needs to be shared, a collective good versus good of a kind of single organization. But on the technology side, if you're looking from a consumer-facing perspective, UX has proved to be a big roadblock to adoption. As soon as I have to ask people to download something, install something, go to a separate bank to buy something else, I've just lost them. So I think that's where different challenges emerge.
That's right. So along with the user experience, there's also the factor of risk, right? Not many organizations right now, they feel comfortable. And this is true both for corporates as well as for government side. Not a lot of agencies and project sponsors, they feel comfortable with their users having to take ownership of their keys. And if they lose their keys, that's a big question that we keep getting all the time. What if they lose their keys? And to tackle all of those things in a true decentralized manner becomes a little tricky. So we just go, the typical route. We have to throw in a little bit of centralization every once in a while.
I think you hit the nail on the head. It's people. I mean, people is the biggest challenge to getting this to move forward. The technology is something that we can address. But within established business, I think there's misaligned incentives. That blockchain brings benefit generally to a broad section of the organization, whereas business today exists in siloed functional segments. So bridging that gap and aligning incentives within one organization, let alone many, is very difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, for example, I had a meeting this week with the CFO of a Fortune 100 company, and after a couple of hours, he said, I totally understand what you're saying. He said, the biggest challenge that we have is us, our corporate DNA, trying to get not only external stakeholders aligned on where they should be using this technology and how to use it, the IP management, all those things, but how do you get people internally within these large organizations to understand that, guess what, we're actually going to disintermediate what you do.
Yeah, and I think that leads perfectly into the next question. So I'll start with you, Chris. What are the big challenges that you see in terms of getting the consortiums together and the governance processes around that?
Yeah, so the consortia build is really the hardest part, right? The technology is easy, it's the getting everybody together. So the first bit is, how are you going to approach? So is this a single entity that has a great idea and they're trying to bring people to the table? Or is this a group of folks that have come together and settled on a use case? And each one of those things is going to have a big impact on how you establish your governance model, how you establish your IP ownership, all those different things. So actually we do a lot of work around how to effectively set up a consortia, because without naming names, we were talking earlier about one in particular that set up what they think or thought is a great idea, and now they really can't get the other players into the system because those other players are nervous around what's the competitive advantage that that person has built into this that I can't see?
I think that's exactly right. It's incentivization. How do you get many people to participate and adhere to a rule set pushed forward by other members of the same ecosystem? So, aligning those incentives and getting a mechanism by which other folks can join at a later date is a challenging and complex issue.
Yeah, I think one factor is also that it's difficult for organizations to even, again, goes back to the use case, right? It's one thing to set up the consortium as a platform to be able to share data, but when it comes down to the reality of business, it's just not easy to decide what data needs to be shared and how it needs to be managed. And that becomes a pretty big bottleneck in any data being even sent through that sharing platform. Oops. Okay.
Yeah, like similarly on our side, where we are trying to build a consortium with a series of corporate management organizations and creative industries, the problem just not goes limited to the data, but also cross-border. Corporate organizations by design are one per jurisdiction, and the laws and legislation changes across borders. So you have not just a barrier of people coming together and agreeing, but different jurisdictions and different entities operating on different legislation. That creates a whole different set of complexities, and sieving through that can at times be both time consuming and exhausting, and can be a bit of a barrier to adoption from my side as well.
Yeah, the other thing that we see a lot is because there are no standards and there's no real interoperability, you have companies worrying about, well, if I adopt on this particular platform, have I picked the wrong horse, right? Am I going to have a legacy technology stack that I don't know what to do with down the road? So that's another big question, and why so many firms like ours are looking into how do we get to that interoperability.
Yeah. It's interesting, Sapan, you mentioned about the point. So you have picked up a very interesting use case around ebooks and the visual arts perspective. What was the process that you followed to identify that this use case is right for blockchain, and what are the components that went into defining the use case itself?
Coincidentally, we did not start with a use case that we have building currently on. The team started as a pure research exercise to just get their feet wet on and see that, is this thing for real, or is this something that you just see on paper? And as part of doing a couple of research projects or POCs internally, what we inherently realized was the use cases that we are building for are not the real problem to be solved. We need to actually build an underlying infrastructure which provides an ability for artists to actually put a claim to in a public fashion that they are indeed creators of the work they have done. Inherently, the way the business works is, the more information is out in public, the better is your standing in the market and how you are compensated for your future and current works. So by design, it creates that underlying infrastructure layer that needs to be present for use cases to be functional. So that's where our focus is. Use cases for us is a means and a ways of creating that core infrastructure for artists and seeking adoption and learning more about what needs to go into that layer.
So Chris, what's the methodology that you see typically that you adopt with clients to help them define the use case?
Yeah, so typically we'll start with the single client and help them just sort of understand where they should be thinking about this, generally speaking. But really one of the preferred methods is for them to then identify who are some of the key people in their ecosystem. And let's then bring 3 or 4 of them to the table, and then we can start talking about not only common pain points. I always like to say, let's ask the question, what's the problem? But then who owns the problem? And if it's not a shared problem and people don't have enough incentive, enough alignment, then that use case just it kind of goes away. Those will come later, I think. But really what we need to do is we need to get everybody around the table to say, this is something that we'll all benefit from, and therefore they're equally aligned to try to move forward.
I think in addition to looking at it from the individual firm perspective, taking the perspective of a larger industry group is something that we've done a lot of. So the strategic design of industry-wide efforts, and then founding business cases predicated on return on investment, right? So by virtue of installing the system, what are our savings going to be? What is the impact to business?
So it's interesting, you picked up a public blockchain use case from an enterprise perspective, which is one, very unique, and secondly, not something that a lot of people have tried. How did you figure out that the public blockchain was the right for you and not to build a private permission setup for the use case that you selected?
We did not approach it from a point of view that we need to work with public. It again boils down to what is the needs of the business and how does the business operate. The business that of the creative industries inherently operate on the premise that people out there know what is there and collectively agree or have a deep understanding of who is the artist, why they have created, what are they claiming to be their factor. While having said that, there's also a business predicament that needs to be kept in mind. For example, in creative industries, if two people have created, what's the split of royalties happening between them is their business and no one else's business. So there has to be a full business jurisdiction or business lens that need to be kept in mind on what you expose and what you not. And that's where a factor comes into play of what do we actually put on public and where do we use public and where do we not. Also, just another element that we considered was going by pure public in current sense probably is not the best operationally from a cost perspective, from a throughput perspective. So hybrid model in that case made the most sense for us, where by design and how the industry and business model operates, you should ideally be having some component in public, which we do that, but other elements which are pure business sense need to remain outside of the public purview.
Yeah, and from the lab perspective, we get a lot of questions from the large enterprises around the public chains. Where should they be thinking about not so much adopting them, but where will our solutions eventually intersect with public chains? And we're going to have to need that functionality. I kind of call it the on-ramp, off-ramp to the public domain. And where does that begin and where does it end? And that's one of the big design questions that we talk about, not for today's solutions and rollouts, but how do we kind of future-proof and prepare for things like merge mining or other public things that we're going to need to use in an enterprise blockchain?
In fact, one of the things which I've seen very frequently is that enterprises, lots of times, they tend to approach public blockchains with a degree of caution, with a high degree of caution, and it's about the adherence to, be it GDPR or some such regulations, or the ability to be able to manage data more effectively, the censorship-resistant model of public chains, that becomes usually an area of caution for corporates.
Well said. I think the corporates generally look at the public blockchains as what could potentially happen to their business, right? What do I need to defend against moving forward? And they'll respond with a permission blockchain looking to defend their existing business. I think the exciting area that we're in right now is between those two realities, right? The current existing state of business and what could potentially be next. So what we're all seeing going on in the marketplace is a combination of folks looking to defend position and potentially compete for market share moving forward.
So in terms of, we've seen a lot of adoption on the public side of things. We've seen a lot of startups building some really innovative solutions in the blockchain space. On the enterprise side, things have been really slow. From a legal and regulatory perspective, what do you think are the biggest challenges that need to be overcome for that adoption to really go mainstream?
The lawyers, I think, are on board. If you sit down with a group of corporate lawyers, they're happy to understand, and if you can explain to them, listen, you're not sharing data more than you are today, then they're generally comfortable with what you're proposing. I think the unstructured and somewhat unclear regulatory environment from a value transfer perspective certainly influences, distributed ledger implementations. But realistically, if you can bring benefit to the business, there's no reason they wouldn't jump on it today. I alluded to it earlier, but the benefit of blockchain often isn't ascribed to a single business unit. And that in and of itself creates political strife within organizations and makes implementing these things very difficult.
Yep, goes back to the same point I was trying to make earlier. Generally, regulatory implications with something as new as blockchain is still not very clear. And it's not about, so if it was clear about what needs to be done to be compliant, as well as continue to use the technology, the answers would have been very clear in front of us, right? Right now, you've got a whole bunch of organizations trying different design patterns, different architectural patterns, and nobody's really very sure. I think everybody, I've come across several, and the general consensus, no pun intended here, but the general consensus is we'll have to wait for a few of these litigations to happen and then see which way the cookie crumbles, right? That's going to set the precedent for what's done and what's not, what's the best way to be compliant with blockchain.
Yeah, so from a pure regulatory perspective, we're starting to get some more comfort. We had the SEC no action letter in financial services in January, I think it was. Of course, Chris Giancarlo is, again, financial services, CFTC is very positive. But we're starting to see other regulators come to the table and embrace, blockchain-based solutions. But the one common theme that at least I see with our clients is that right now the regulators don't really care if you're using an Excel spreadsheet or a blockchain, as long as you comply with the current regulatory mandates. And that's one of the reasons why we've seen the rise of the STOs, right? Because those are much more compliant in terms of having registrations, KYC, AML, all those things. So I think in a way, the blockchain community needs to really understand and embrace what the regulators need instead of the other way around.
Yeah, but see, tokenization use cases, they are not everything happening on blockchain is just about tokenization. So regulators and everybody, in fact, right, have been more focused on tokenization aspects, the non-tokenized aspects, even let's say something as simple as supply chain, right? And when I say simple, I just mean to stay away from tokenization aspects for such use cases. Even those enterprises are kind of fearful to put how much of data can be thrown onto the chain just from privacy or GDPR or later manageability of the data kind of concerns.
We haven't had a lot of use cases operate for a very long time. We have seen great ideas come up, but no one has really seen the implications of how customers, regulators, jurisdiction, or other people in the consortium would react to something that has been operating and stable for some time. And I think that fear of unknown, for the lack of a better term, or the possibilities of unknown that are open is somehow also leading to some of these inhibitions around it.
And this leads to an interesting point, like how do you decide in your use cases or when you work with your clients, how much privacy and how much transparency should be there, what goes really on chain, what's something that you take just off, just so that you make sure that the solution doesn't create any problems in the future?
It's a business requirement from square one, I think, right? The business is going to dictate what they're comfortable sharing or not sharing. You can lay the options on the table, but ultimately it's a function of the business and what they're comfortable, is it inventory that we're sharing? Yes or no? Is it, personal data? Yes or no? Customer data, etc. But quite often I find that to be a requirement walking into the room.
Yeah, it's one of the first requirements. What are we going to share? What are we comfortable sharing? Because there's a lot of fear, and in some cases, rightly so.
Yeah, well, exactly the same thing. It's the fear of the unknown that's basically driving.
I think with all the news that we hear about data and Cambridge Analytica and everything else, the question in our industry is more about consent and security, and where and how the consent is achieved and what it is achieved for, how much people are actually aware of when they're consenting to something is more of a question in our mind rather than, we talk about consent and security rather than privacy and security when it comes to picture. And as other people have pointed out, that's the number one place you start from after there's an agreement that there's a common problem to be solved for.
One question that you mentioned around also was around the UX and the general experience out there. Apart from that, from a technology and an infrastructure perspective, what do you think are the biggest challenges that still exist and need to be solved for enterprises to be comfortable? We all see that, whenever we go and talk to the clients out there, their perspective always ends up to be, this is too difficult for me to handle. I don't have the right set of resources. What is the infrastructure that I need to use?
Yeah, so that's another interesting point, right? And a huge area of discussion right now. Right now, if you compare other technology areas, like let's say just enterprise applications using Java or .NET or even JavaScript, right? JavaScript is probably one of the newest entrants in this whole enterprise market space, IT space. And even JavaScript development is a whole lot more mature than blockchain development. Right now, there are no straightforward answers when it comes to proactive monitoring of applications when they go live on a blockchain. There is very less monitoring ability for the resource consumption for online applications on the chain. Plus, now you look at the development side of the picture, right? The amount of tooling that's required, the amount of effort that's currently being spent, the level of productivity just because of lack of tooling, of mature tooling on the blockchain space is extremely telling when you compare it to something like Java development or JavaScript or .NET. I think it's just early days, and it will all fall in place at some point, and then we should start seeing at least that barrier removed when it comes to blockchain development.
I think beyond the performance issues that we're all relatively well aware with, DJ, you hit on the big points. Yeah, you left me with nothing. No, I think that was correct, Chris.
Yeah, no, I agree.
This was a fairly simple question. So I think we have a couple of minutes left. I would like to open this up to the audience if they want to ask any question.
I don't think there are any mics out there.
Okay, hey guys, thanks for taking time for questions. My name's Evan Fung. I guess back to a point that you mentioned, Chris. You mentioned interoperability, so I just wanted to go back to that, whether it's with Cosmos or Polkadot, there are projects that are going to be able to enable better communication between the different projects and chains that exist today. So how does that maybe offset some of the fears of selection error that you guys talked about with respect to enterprise projects? If in the future it's easier to switch things over, doesn't it mean maybe there's less problems today to pick a chain and start building on top of that? Thanks.
And again, I'm just talking from the large enterprise perspective. I think to your point, those projects and the success of those projects will ease some of those fears over time, but it's going to take time. We're going to need to see the proof in the pudding that, yeah, we are able to do these things and have these interoperate or be able to switch from one stack to another. And again, it takes a little time. You guys probably saw, we did one on an Ethereum platform in Dublin a couple of weeks ago. I know that our competitors have had similar success. It's just going to take time, and then we'll start to get the C-suite at these large enterprises comfortable.
I think that's right. Architecting for interoperability from the get-go is key to everything that we're doing to allow for that abstraction between switch components later on down the line.
And funnily, that is one of the development strategies that we very frequently employ. That you start building, don't worry about what platform you might want to be on 5 years from now. You start building on what's suits your purposes today, with a migration strategy for if you need to move off of that to something else.
At the end of the day, the conversation is going to shift to products and user benefits. The true adoption for blockchain will happen when the customer will not know that they're using blockchain in the background. It's all about what are the benefits that I'm getting. And to reach that point will take a lot of time. And primarily because we are moving away from the mindset of one neck to choke to a consortium base where benefits are shared and flaws are shared. And that's a big move and a change in mindset and culture, which will take its own time.
I know there was a, you may want to come ahead.
Hey, DJ. Hey. So I have a question actually for you guys. Looking at the enterprise aspect of the blockchain, how do you kind of quantify the success of an enterprise blockchain in the current scenario and perhaps a year or two down the line?
So the question is, how do you quantify the success of an enterprise blockchain implementation in the current scenario and future? What would be the steps that would change?
I would say I'd measure success based upon return value to the alliance. So relative to the investment made to create the utility, what is the annualized savings that those members are collecting?
Yeah, I mean, from the enterprise perspective, at least with the folks that we talk to, I think the success factor is pretty clear. Forget does it work, the question is, does it deliver ROI, right? Companies the blockchain tourism phase is over. Prove to me that it works, and more importantly, prove to me that it's actually, even at the beginning, going to deliver value, because if it doesn't, there's no point in a science experiment.
You touched on the fears of kind of laying your back office functions bare to the world for everyone to see, but that's obviously an inevitability of the technology. Can you expand a little bit more on that?
In much the same way that you want to abstract your systems, you'd want to abstract those processes, right? So you maintain what's private to your organization, but only share what pieces of data are common to you and your counterparties. So by maintaining your privacy and what data you need to maintain internally, and not putting that on chain, you're still allowing for that flow of information between the two parties such that you can affect the process more efficiently, but maintain what you need to maintain in terms of private records.
I think we're out of time. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.